Hello and welcome to part 14 of the ongoing AS and A-level Python series, and in this episode we are going to be looking at functions. Alright, so functions in Python provide organized, reusable and modular code to perform a set of specific actions. And functions, generally they simplify the coding process by preventing redundant logic and making sure that the code is easier to follow. So in other words, functions are a very good way to keep your code organized, and you always want to make sure that when you write a certain piece of code, you can wrap it inside of a function, and that function can actually then call it whenever you want that certain logic to be implemented in your particular program. So let's actually go ahead and start by looking at how you can define a function in Python. So in order to define a function, you can make use of the def keyword, short for define, and then what follows is the function name. So maybe let's actually define a function called greeting, right? And after the function name, you are supposed to put a pair of parentheses, right? Then after the parentheses, you put a colon. Then the colon marks what we call the function header. So this line here, this entire line on line number 5, we call that the function header. Then after declaring the header, when you go to the next line, you indent inwards to show that you are now inside of the function. So whatever code you write indented under the function header, it's going to be the body of that particular function. So for this particular function, let's actually just create a greeting called hello world, right? And that's all we have to do really in order to define a function. So you realize that it's quite a simple function, but of course we'll improve on it as we progress with the tutorial. So if I were to compile and run this code, you'd realize that I won't get anything down there in the console. Right, so let's just go ahead and call the functions, call the Python interpreter. Then we want it to interpret the functions keyword, the functions file. So you realize that we do not get any output in the console. Right, so what we basically need to do is we actually need to call this particular function. And in order to call a function, what you simply do is you simply write its name. Is it? So this time around, if we come and compile and execute that particular script, you would realize that we get the words hello world printed down there in the console. So that's how you can call a function. So just typing the function's name will call a particular function. So for this particular function, I think maybe you might agree with me that it's not really useful because it's just doing something that's fixed, as it were. So we can actually define a function that can take arguments, as it were. So let's create a function called improved greeting. Then for the body, rather inside of the parentheses in the header, what we need to do is we can declare a message called a variable called message, right? So you just type message there. So what we do is we can then say hello, then we can put a comma, then message, right? So having done this, we actually need to call the function. So let's call the function. Let me just double click here so that I copy the name, paste it here. Then what's the message that I want to pass as an argument to this one? Maybe let's just say I want to pass the word world. Alright, so when I compile and execute this, because Python doesn't compile, it interprets. So when I execute this, you realize that I get the words hello world printed down there in the console, right? So in order to show that there's it's actually calling a different method altogether, let me just change the text right here. So maybe let me just make it hello Python, right? So running the file one more time, you realize that we get the words hello Python. So that's the essence of functions that take arguments. So arguments are going to be placeholders for, rather they are going to be, when you write like this, it's actually going to be a parameter, right? Then when you pass it during runtime, like in this instance, it's actually now an argument. So you can think of it as a parameter, as a placeholder. As you can see there, over here, right here on this tooltip, it's saying it's a parameter, is it, and the name is message, and it can be anything really. So whatever I pass when I call this method, the actual value that I put in place of that placeholder is actually going to be the argument. So this one is taking Python as an argument. Then I can call the same method, I can call the same function. Sorry, this time around I can say, maybe let me say, just say 263, right, and just an integer. Then I can actually say, maybe let's create a person this time. Hello Adam, right? So if we run this, you realize that we get all those different outputs. So we get hello Python, hello 263, hello Adam. So this is what the code reuse that we were talking about in the introduction of this tutorial, right? When we say that functions, they allow us to reuse code, or to reuse a certain piece of logic. So the logic that we are implementing in this case, we know that we want to greet someone, right? So we wrapped our logic inside of a function. Then whenever we want to invoke that function, we are making use of the the arguments that we pass, as it were. Then we can actually define a function which has optional arguments. So optional arguments, they are useful particularly in the event that the user fails to pass an argument. Alright, let me just demonstrate. Optional, maybe let's call this one even better greeting. Even better greeting. I know the name is rather long, but it will do for this demonstration. So we want to print hello, then we will say MSG, short for message, right? Then we actually need to declare the message right here. So what we can do is we can set the default value for message right here in the function header. So maybe let's say we want to say computer, right? That's the default message. So when we now come down here and we invoke this particular method, right, in the first instance I'm actually going to pass in a value. So maybe let me say the value that I want to pass is science, right? Then in the second instance I'm actually going to deliberately omit the argument. So I'm not going to pass in an argument. So I want you to observe what happens when we run this code. So we run that. So starting from the bottom of the output right here, you see that we get hello computer, right? So the reason why it's giving us hello computer is because we told it here when we defined this function that should the user fail to give us an argument during runtime, the default value for the parameter is going to be computer. So if you do not receive a parameter, just use computer as your string. So that's why it's giving us hello computer here, right? Then on line 23, what we did is we actually passed an argument called science, which is a string. And since we provided an argument in that case, it's actually going to take that argument and use that. So basically this argument that we pass is actually going to override this optional or this default value that we had assigned in the parameter declaration right there. So that's how you can declare a method that takes optional arguments, right? This is quite useful should a user fail to provide some arguments, right? You can always have a default value so that your program doesn't crash, as it were. Because if you were to just call a method that expects an argument, right, and you don't pass in arguments, it's actually not going to work. So that's important note. Then also functions can return a value, right? Functions that return values are actually useful. Like maybe if you still remember in the list episode, I think we looked at the pop function, is it? And we did see that when you call pop, we are actually going to let me just demonstrate it. So let's have a list called letters, right? And what are the letters that we need to have? We need to have A, B, then we also need to have C, right? Then if I say letters dot pop, right, I'm actually going to print this. right here. So I want to print letters.pop, right? So let's just go ahead and run that. You realize that I'm getting C, is it? So pop is an example of a function that was written by the developers of by the creators of Python, and the way it works is that when you call pop, it actually returns a value. So the value that it returns is whatever element it has removed from the list, is it? So it actually gives you back that particular value. So that's the whole idea of values, or rather functions that return a value. So how do you create a function that that returns a value? So you can create a function, maybe let's call it square number. Then inside of square number, in the parameter declaration, it actually takes a number. Then what it does with the number is that it's actually going to return number times number, is it? Then when we actually come down here and call, let's just print square number and we'll pass it a value of 9, right? You actually see that we get the value of 81 printed down there in the console. So you see here, you see that we get 81. So that's the essence of a function that returns a value, right? How do you know that a function is going to return a value, or how do you define a function that will return a value? You make use of the return keyword, right? So you put the return at the end of what of the function body, and you state whatever value you want it to return. So in this case, we want it to return the number multiplied by the number. So that's how you can define a function that that basically returns a value. So yeah, I think that's just about it for this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one.